thought by way of personal introduction, I'd explain why I came to have an interest in Werner von Braun. And to do that, we need to go all the way back to my childhood. This is a typical terrace street, very similar to the one I grew up in my junior school, infant and junior school ages in Bolton, Lancashire, 1950s. At the time, my mum's sister, one of my mum's sisters, was a nurse, and she happened to be a midwife health visitor. This is a picture of the kind of thing that went on in those days. It's hard to imagine, isn't it, in our day, that was the way that midwifery cared for people out in their homes. And my mum's other sisters lived in America, and this sister, Auntie Nan, discovered there was an exchange program for nurses. And so she entered the system and visited the USA for, I think it was 2 years, as a midwife visitor over there. When she returned, we took her to the RMS Franconia in Liverpool, where we were able to go on board, have a look around the ship, and then the hooter seat sounded for us to leave the ship, and so off Auntie Nan went to the USA. When she came back, she brought a book from the States about rockets and space. Oops, that's gone too quickly. It wasn't this particular one, but it was one very similar. And at that stage, I came across Werner von Braun because he was such an important figure in the development of rockets into space. There was also, it's done it again, a lot of interest in things like Eagle Comic, Dan Dare, and then my first bike, this is when I was 11 going on 12, a rally Space Rider. Lots of things got branded with space themes. And a few years later, my best friend at the time, who was a little older than me, got a full-size bike. And that was a rally Space Rider. And you can see the space theme again running through my boyhood. And the real thing, the Blue Streak, was developed by the British and had tests in Woomera, Australia. And so we now go to the theme of Werner von Braun, way beyond rocket science. And it was an amazing journey through his life, as I'm sure you will see. I've called this World War II bogeyman or space race hero. I don't think we have to choose. I think he was both. Who was he? Well, this is a photograph, center there, of a little boy. He was born in 1912 to a very wealthy family, an aristocratic one. His father was a baron and founder of the German Savings Bank, member of the Weimar Republic cabinet and Minister of Agriculture. His mum was a musician, amateur astronomer, and she was a strong influence on him, giving him a telescope as a present on the day of his confirmation in the Lutheran Church. He was inspired by a man called von Oberth and another one called Opel, whose name appears on many cars these days. At 12 years old, 1924, he first experimented with rockets of his own by strapping toy rocket fireworks to a coaster wagon like this one. It sped around in random directions, cloud of smoke trailing behind it until the fireworks burned out, which caused a major commotion in a crowded street. So he was taken into police custody until his father came and collected him. This is a reference to Hermann Oberth, whose book interested the young von Braun. And it was quite technical. It had lots of physics and chemistry within it. And as he got a little older, von Braun developed his interest further. He was also inspired by experiments that Fritz von Opel, the founder of the Opel car company, was undertaking. In 1928, he experimented with a rocket-powered plane, and then with a rocket-powered racing car, and then with a rocket-powered thing on railway. In 1928, the car that he designed, the RAC 2, topped 230 kilometers an hour using 24 solid fuel rockets. And it was one of the first cars to use inverted wings to produce aerodynamic downforce. So these were days when technology was developing very rapidly indeed, and big changes were afoot. 1930 Berlin. This is a photograph of Hermann Oberth, the author of the book that so fascinated von Braun, dealing with some of the team that was helping him develop rockets at that stage. He's about to demonstrate a liquid fuel rocket engine, and the second from the right, almost behind Oberth, is the young Werner von Braun at only 18 years of age. It paid, did it not, to have connections, rich connections in that society for him. His first paid army work started in 1932, where he was working practically on the development of rocket technology. Meanwhile, there was the rise of National Socialism. It developed from the German Workers' Party as the Nazi Party, founded in 1920, blending socialist aims with fashionable ideas emerging from evolutionary theory, especially the principle of survival of the fittest. And from that developed the evolutionary science, so-called, of eugenics, which means the selective biological improvement of the human race. And Hitler and his cronies, many of them signed up to that theory and developed the idea of the subhuman, which was then applied to people like gypsies and Jews, with all the horrid consequences that flowed from that. And it's important to remember that these notions were not confined to Germany. They were present in Britain, particularly in right-wing politics, and they were also widespread in parts of the USA. So it's easy to point the finger at Germany alone, but these were very widespread ideas and could have led to much worse in our own country. Tragically, these ideas were to mix master race objectives with anti-Semitism. Article 24 of the Nazi Party platform declared in 1920, the party as such upholds the point of view of a positive Christianity without tying itself confessionally to any one confession. That's Roman Catholic, Protestant, or whatever. It combats the Jewish materialistic spirit at home and abroad, and is convinced that a permanent recovery of our people, that's the Germans, can only be achieved within and on the basis of the common good before individual good. There was even a group called German Christians. Here's a photograph of them celebrating Luther Day in Berlin in 1933, led by a man called Bishop Hosenfelder. And you can see the mixture of Christian symbols and the horrid swastika in that particular shot. It was a very, very unholy alliance. Now, von Braun was a member for a while of an SS equestrian unit, 1933 to 34, joined the Nazi Party in 1938, becoming a junior SS officer in 1940. The Germanic script there is an image from his identity card for the SS, and below, although he's somewhat obscured, here's a photograph with the infamous Heinrich Himmler and von Braun immediately behind him, but obscured by the figure in front of him. So he was amongst the SS at least from 1938. But all that seems to be due to pressure put upon him to conform if he wanted to advance with his technological developments. In March to May of 1944, he was actually imprisoned for disloyalty because he refused to put his weight behind an SS takeover of the V2 rocket program. And actually, he didn't think they were capable enough and preferred working with the army. Conclusion: his SS involvement was not ideologically driven, but motivated by a desire to get ahead with the rocketry. He was an extremely focused scientist. This was the first generation rocket-powered vengeance weapon, so-called. This was the V1 flying bomb that was developed over the period 1939 to 43. And for the sake, why vengeance weapons? For the sake of improving USAF firebombing capabilities, a mock-up was built and repeatedly burned down. It contained full-scale replicas of German residential homes. Firebombing attacks proved quite successful, and in a series of attacks by the RAF and the USAF on Hamburg in July 1943, roughly 50,000 civilians were killed and large areas of the city destroyed. Hence, the German development of what they called vengeance weapons. It was to get their own back on what we were doing to them. This is an example of RAF bomb damage in an unnamed city in 1943. You can see the sheer devastation that was caused there. This is RAF bomb damage in Kassel in October of 1943. Again, that's what we did to German civilians, not simply to the military elements of Nazi Germany. This was the V1 weapon in Peenemünde, the so-called Doodlebog, in 1944, being taken to its ramp for launching, and it's from there that they did such damage in London. This is Upper Norwood in London of June 1944, with an elderly man and his dog sitting on rubble following a V1 attack, and he'd only been out for a walk with his wife, while his wife prepared Sunday lunch. And when he returned, the house was damaged and his wife had died. Just a personal example of the tragedies of the outcome. And to fund all this, in some ways, it was partly funded by Jewish slave laborers. These Jewish people, under those conditions, working at Peenemünde, which was the main center for the development of the rocketry. This is Von Braun at Peenemünde with his Nazi Party lapel badge, 21st of March 1941. So that's fairly early in the stages of his working with the army for that purpose. This is Emil Leib, the chief of Nazi ordnance, and horribly, Fritz Todt, who was the Reich Minister of Armaments and responsible for the development of the forced labor program, which forced people such as gypsies and Jews in horrendous conditions to work for the German war effort. This is an example of Jewish slave labor in Mittelbau-Dora concentration camp. What they're doing here is making components for the V2 rocket. Here's General Erich Feldgiebel, head of the German Army Information Service, congratulating members of von Braun's rocket team, especially for an A4 rocket flight of 1942, from which the V2 rocket was developed. And in June 1944, an A4 rocket became the first vehicle to enter space. So von Braun's ambitions to get into space were achieved at that stage, albeit in connection with warfare. This is a photograph taken by Flight Lieutenant R.A. Lenton and Sergeant Haney of the RAF in 1943 of one of the rocket stands in Peenemünde. This is a test stand, and this is a launch from that test stand in 1943. This is von Braun's V2 ballistic missile. We'll not go into all the components there, just to draw attention to the scale of the rocket. That's a human figure, and that is the warhead. All the rest is to do with navigation of the vehicle, the fuel, and the engines. And this is a post-war replica of one of those rockets, excuse me, and it reached velocities of 3,400 miles an hour, traveling so fast that they were virtually impossible, if not impossible, to detect, as they caused such damage as this one in London and this one in Limehouse of London in 1945, not long before I was born. In total, V2s killed nearly 3,000 members of the British public and injured a further 6,500. Towards the end of the war, this is 3rd of May 1945, we see von Braun and his colleagues meeting with US forces to surrender. Why did they surrender to the US? I prayed, says von Braun, during the last days in Germany when things collapsed all around me. Indeed, during those hours of decision, when we decided to surrender to the Americans, my anxiety was at the bursting point. I prayed then that our surrender would be accepted in good faith. And to get there, they'd traveled a considerable distance because Peenemünde was closer to the Russian advance into Germany. And this team of von Braun did not want any of the technology falling into the hands of the Russians. They wanted it to go to the West. And there's an intriguing little bit of information about why that happened in a few minutes. The operation, called Special Mission V2, was initiated by planners and US troops instructed to remove all rocket hardware that they could get their hands on under the direction of the 144th Motor Vehicle Assembly Company. The troops were aided by local workers and railway engineers to transport that hardware by rail from Nordhausen to Antwerp to be shipped then to the USA. The first train load departed on the 22nd of May 45 and the last departed on May the 31st. That's a huge amount of material being transported just one day before Soviet forces were expected to arrive to assume jurisdiction of the area. So it was rescued for the West by a whisker, you might say. A total of 341 railway trucks were loaded, containing enough hardware to make about 100 V2 missiles. That was transferred to Liberty ships. These were often converted passenger ships from pre-war at the port of Antwerp and shipped to New Orleans, transported to New Mexico. This is some of those components going by train through Germany. Concurrent with arranging the transfer of this rocketry hardware was a search for and transfer of documents, vital documents. Werner von Braun already knew he couldn't carry all the necessary documents with him in surrendering, so implemented a plan before doing so. They contain detailed evaluations of German rocketry dating from 1932 to 45. Two of his colleagues have been ordered to hide these documents in an abandoned mine or some similar place. And a vast archive was indeed hidden in a tunnel at the edge of the Harz Mountains. The search for these by US troops, aided by some of those German scientists, turned up 14 tons of documents from that tunnel by May 21st, 1945, by which stage, by the way, I was 1 week old. So on the 2nd of May, von Braun made this statement. We knew that we had created a new means of warfare, and the question as to what nation, to what victorious nation we were willing to entrust this brainchild of ours, was a moral decision more than anything else. We wanted to see the world spared another conflict such as Germany had just been through, and we felt that only by surrendering such a weapon to a people who were guided by the Bible could such an assurance to the world be best secured. So there had been some resurrection of Christian conscience during this period. The first group of 7 German scientists, headed by von Braun, arrived in Boston in the USA 29th September 1945, and before that they departed, von Braun spent 2 weeks in Britain, where he was questioned by Sir Alwyn Crowe and other British Ministry of Supply officials, who were also very keen to get access to the information that was available. And the main body of the German scientists began arriving at Fort Bliss, Texas, to start a United States guided missile program in 1945. By the end of February, that is, they handed over 100 of those. They were quartered, that is people, they were quartered in converted military buildings that gradually became more home-like. His colleagues have begun arriving in the USA from Germany towards the end of 1945. Most travelled across the Atlantic in troop ships, but the top guys were transported by one of these relatively new DC-4 super mainliners. And 4 years after the last V2 fell in London, the British Interplanetary Society named Werner von Braun as an honorary fellow in 1949. Technological progress itself was making the Nazi scientists seem both less magical and less dangerous. Few knew about his Christian conversion. Now, in Texas, while he was living at Fort Bliss near the US development site, a neighbor invited von Braun to church. He went expecting to find the religious equivalent of a country club. Instead, he found a small white frame building with a vibrant congregation of people who loved the Lord. He realized that he had been morally adrift and that he needed to surrender himself to God. He was converted, and over the coming years was quite outspoken in his evangelical faith. And in 1966, a pastor called C.M. Ward interviewed him at the George Marshall Space Center, run by NASA, in Huntsville, Alabama, where von Braun was the director. Von Braun contrasted the large empty cathedrals of Europe, excuse me, to the large number of churches he found in Texas, many meeting in temporary buildings, pastored by humble preachers driving second-hand buses who led thriving congregations. The German scientist was impressed and noted, "Here is a growing, aggressive church, not a dignified, half-dead institution. Here is spiritual life." One of the outcomes from that interview was published in 1966 under a title agreed by von Braun, saying, "The further we probe into space, the greater my faith." The American rocket development continued. This was the High Rock, 1947. This was the Redstone, 1958. This was the Saturn I, 1961. All of these developed largely by von Braun and his colleagues. This is a photo of von Braun much later in life with just one of the 5 Saturn V engines. These were the engines used in the Apollo 11 mission. So his career was an enormously long and complex one and extremely productive in scientific terms. According to NASA, he was one of the most important rocket developers and champions of space exploration in the 20th century. This is the Saturn for the Apollo 11 mission. That was launched in 1969 on the 16th of July and resulted in the safe arrival of Neil Armstrong on the moon on the 20th of July, 1969. Velocity of 2,500 miles an hour average for the journey. And Armstrong famously said, "That's one step for a man, one giant leap for mankind." With the moon race won and US space budget slashed, all that emerged from that was the Space Shuttle program, a reusable vehicle conceived to service a space station. But without a space station, there was none. Not so much as space policy was once said of it, as an excuse not to have one. But the von Braun paradigm or his designs remained close to the hearts of many, and Skylab, consequently, was launched successfully in 1971. He died of cancer not long afterwards, 1977, nearly 5 years before the first US space shuttle flight. But his plans lived on, and also his statements of faith live on to our very day. This was the first successful mission of the space shuttle Atlantis from Edwards Air Base in California in 1989, and 2 defense communications satellites were launched into geostationary orbit from that program. The flight lasting 4 days, 1 hour, 44 minutes, etc. It landed back on runway 23 at Edwards. So now a recoverable space vehicle, not one that went off and never returned. The primary objective of the mission was to deploy the Galileo spacecraft on a 6-year journey all the way to Jupiter. So we'll come to some of the Von Braun faith comments. This is in a letter to the California State Board of Education in 1972. My experiences with science led me to God. People challenge science to prove the existence of God. But must we really light a candle to see the sun? There are those who argue that the universe evolved out of a random process. But what random process could produce the brain of a man or the system of the human eye? He also said science does not have a moral dimension. It is like a knife. If you give it to a surgeon or a murderer, each will use it differently. For me, Von Braun says, the idea of creation is not conceivable without invoking the necessity of design. One cannot be exposed to the law and order of the universe without concluding there must be design and purpose behind it all. There cannot be a gigantic master plan without a master planner behind it. This master planner is he whom we call the creator of the universe. One cannot be exposed to the law and order of the universe without concluding there must be a divine intent behind it all. And of course, Von Braun is not alone in the scientific community to say such things. This is Sir Fred Hoyle, the British man, Professor of Astronomy at Cambridge. Life cannot have had a random beginning. The trouble is, he says, that there are about 2,000 enzymes, and the chance of obtaining one of them is only 1 part in 10 to the power 40,000. An outrageously small probability that could not be faced even if the whole universe consisted of organic soup. That was 1981. So more statement from Von Braun. Any effort to visualize God, to reduce him to our comprehension, to describe him in our language, beggars his greatness. I find it best to accept God as an intelligent will, perfect in goodness, revealing himself to the world of experience. Thus, in this age of space travel, which dramatizes the immensity of the universe, men must enlarge their concept of God and recognize that he is not a local deity of this planet, but the creator and master of everything. Manned spaceflight is an amazing achievement, but it has opened the door for us. Just only a tiny door to see the awesome reaches of space. Our outlook through this peephole at the vast mysteries of the universe only confirms our belief in its creator. That quotation comes from that reference in 1969. And it matches a statement in the Bible: the heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. That's Psalm 19 that was written about 1000 BC. Another statement from Von Braun: in this age of spaceflight, when we use the modern tools of science to advance into new regions of human activity, the Bible remains in every way an up-to-date book. Our knowledge and use of the laws of nature that enable us to fly to the moon also enable us to destroy our home planet with the atom bomb. Science itself does not address the question whether we should use the power at our disposal for good or for evil. The guidelines of what we ought to do are furnished in the moral laws of God. Although I know of no reference to Christ ever commenting on scientific work, Von Braun says, I do know that he said, you shall know the truth, and the truth shall make you free. The universe revealed through scientific inquiry is the living witness that God indeed has been at work. Everything science has taught me strengthens my belief in the continuity of our spiritual experience after death. I believe in an immortal soul. Science has proved that not one thing disintegrates into nothingness. Life and soul, therefore, cannot disintegrate into nothingness and so are immortal. We cannot live, he says, without ethical laws and some belief in a last judgment, where every one of us has to account for what he did with God's precious gift here on earth. Now, what about you and me? How do we feel about Von Braun's statements? Just like Werner von Braun, each one of us is on a journey. It's our journey to final judgment. The journey is as real as Neil Armstrong's flight to the moon. But this one is inescapable, whether we believe it or not, and it would be very remiss of me not to draw your attention to it in the closing of this introduction to Werner von Braun. On two separate occasions, Jesus lovingly and solemnly warned of this judgment, once up in the Galilee in the countryside, and once in Jerusalem in the heart of the capital city. And these are some of the things that he said. I tell you that men will have to account on the day of judgment, even for every careless word they have spoken. Another one, I tell you the truth, be careful, for that day will close on you unexpectedly like a trap, and it will come for all on the face of the earth. We should always remember that the Bible teaches there is no other name under heaven through whom we can be saved from that judgment, saved from condemnation, and that's the person of the Lord Jesus Christ. This evening is our opportunity to ponder these things for each of us, without exception, me included, and our leaders. And if you have any questions following on from this, we'll do our best to help should you wish. And I'd now like to hand over the meeting to our pastor, David Steer.